A lot is changing for the New Orleans Saints, and the defensive scheme might be next and most beneficial. We got all of that and a little bit of lagniappe for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? I am your host, your friend, Ross Jackson, New Orleans native, your New Orleans Saints expert and credentialed member of the media covering those New Orleans Saints as a Saints beat writer over at LouisianaSports.net and Saints analyst with WWL TV. And on today's episode of Locked On Saints, New Orleans Saints are very close to hiring their coordinators. We'll give you the updates on each of the three, where we think things might be headed. We'll take a look for our mock draft Monday at building the trenches in the draft. The Saints want to go that way. They have several options on how to do it. We're going to kick everything off, though, with a potential change for the New Orleans Saints, a defensive scheme on the way, why it would be the right choice for New Orleans. We appreciate you very much, as always, for being here, whether it's your first time or your next time. We thank you for coming through this time and making us your first listen, being an everydayer here on the show, which is a proud part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel, where right now new customers get $150 by winning their first $5 bet. Just head over to FanDuel.com to get started. The New Orleans Saints could benefit from a defensive shift when it comes to their scheme and their system. And by the looks of their candidate pool, that shift might be on the way. So far, the New Orleans Saints have conducted 3 interviews with defensive coordinators. They're now able to hire that defensive coordinator, whoever it is that earns that job, is the favorite, whatever it might be, immediately. They've cleared the hurdles. They've done all the things that they need to do in order to do that, satisfy the Rooney Rule, all those other pieces. So the Saints should be making their defensive coordinator hire very soon. When they do, there's a good chance that if they hire from one of the 3 that they've interviewed so far, Minnesota Vikings, defensive passing game coordinator and defensive backs coach Daronte Jones, Christian Parker, the same 2 titles held with the Philadelphia Eagles last year, and then Brandon Staley, who's considered the favorite assistant head coach of the San Francisco 49ers, former head coach of the Los Angeles Chargers. All 3 of those candidates have had extensive experience in what we call 3-4 defenses. Now, we've been kind of tracking this for a little bit since we heard that Brandon Staley was going to be the favorite for the job. That's a 3-4 system. The New Orleans Saints have played kind of a multi-front system over the course of the past few years. A lot of 4-2-5, meaning 4 defensive linemen, 2 linebackers, and then 5 defensive backs. Could be 3 safeties, 2 corners, 3 corners, 2 safeties, whatever it might be. But a 3-4 system, 3 linemen and 4 linebackers might be the right way to go for the New Orleans Saints. And it's going to take some time. It wouldn't just be a switch flipped in 2025 and look, all of a sudden they're a successful 3-4 defense. They might be a 3-4 defense in 2025, but they might not be a successful one until they continue to flip the personnel and change the talent. That's going to take some time. Again, we've consistently talked about 2 things: patience, as well as incremental improvement year over year. But with each of these 3 candidates, Daronte Jones, Christian Parker, and Brandon Staley, you can see kind of the clear criteria of what the New Orleans Saints are interested in. And there seem to be 3 commonalities in which each of these candidates checks at least 2 boxes: familiarity with Kellen Moore, experience in a 3-4 defense, not exclusively, but experience in a 3-4 defense, and then the Vic Fangio coaching tree. Those 3 boxes seem to be checked. At least 2 of those 3 boxes seem to be checked with with all of these candidates. Daronte Jones checks the box of experience, or of 3-4 experience, has also been a part of some of the same kind of like systems and things like that have been Vic Fangio adjacent. You also have Christian Parker, who has familiarity with Kellen Moore, has familiarity with 3-4 defenses, and has coached directly with Vic Fangio, both with time in Denver and of course time in Philly. And then you look at Brandon Staley, who of course checks all 3 boxes as well. That seems to be the direction that the Saints are going. That seems to be the criteria that the Saints are looking for and matching. So whichever one of these candidates gets selected, and I think you have to still consider Brandon Staley the favorite right now. And again, you have to look at him as a defensive coordinator, not his years as a head coach, where his mind is split in a bunch of different ways and all these other things. There's a real chance that the Saints could be looking at a shift when it comes to their defensive scheme. And that's going to mean a shift in defensive personnel as well. I think that Cam Jordan would be somebody that would be able to play a 3-4 defensive end type of role. It would limit him to more of a run-stopping role, but it's a role that he could play. Brian Brzee could bounce outside to be a 5-tech, 3-4 defensive end, and then you have to find sort of that big-bodied nose tackle that can plug up the middle. A guy like a Sebastian Joseph Day, or somebody in the draft like I almost said a Milton Williams. He's a top free agent from the Eagles, but somebody in the draft like a Jalon Walker or a Jordan Phillips out of Maryland. There are certainly those options available for New Orleans to start to either move people around, move personnel and players around, but also be able to add the talent that would still be necessary. Now, you still need those stand-up edge rushers over on the edge. If you allow Carl Granderson to slim down, he immediately plugs in as a 3-4 edge rusher. You could finally put Isaiah Foskey back in that Viper role that he played so extremely well, 11 sacks back-to-back seasons with Notre Dame, the stuff that got him drafted. Again, this has been a bit of a Zach Bond situation. This has been a bit of a not Marcus Davenport, but it's been a bit of these situations where Caden Ellis, right, to where you play somebody in a role in New Orleans that isn't actually the role that got them drafted in the first place. Isaiah Foskey's kind of been held subject to that same situation. He hasn't gotten the same kind of amount of he's gotten a lot more grief about it, but for him, like his role was that of a stand-up edge rusher outside the tackles. He's not asked to do that. He's not been asked to do that in New Orleans over the course of the past couple of years. So you could see those guys, but then you could also draft and develop, right? Find some of those speedy edge rushers in this year's class, of which there are many, and be able to continue to build around that. And then you have the two inside coverage linebackers that you'd like already in DeMario Davis and Pete Werner, but then you could also cycle guys in. You could try to bring Willie Gay back and actually play him in a position that actually suits his game and things like that. Again, a little bit of that playing out of position or being asked to do something that doesn't necessarily elevate what it is that he does. A sideline to sideline athletic coverage type guy that can also bring pressure and all these other pieces. But you need fast processors, all those things, and those guys check some of those boxes. And so I think that for New Orleans, a shift to 3-4 would be actually really positive for them. Might not be positive immediately in 2025, but it would be positive over the course of the sort of incremental improvement that you're looking for year over year over year. Better in terms of being able to attack the outside zone runs, better in terms of being able to have the speed to match up with some of those more athletic quarterbacks in today's game, which are the quarterbacks that are bringing teams to more success nowadays. And so I think with all of that, the hiring of a Brandon Staley, the hiring of a Christian Parker, the potential hiring of a Daronte Jones, any of those three present that opportunity for a change of scheme, for a change of system that could very well benefit New Orleans in the coming years under head coach Kellen Moore. Coming up next, if the New Orleans Saints do want to shift to that 3-4 defense and want to do it quickly, the NFL draft, both early and in the middle rounds, gives them exactly what they need to get it done. We got that coming up for you next as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints is brought to you by our official sports betting partners over at FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, where you can go to make every basketball game ongoing, whether in the NBA or college basketball, even more fun than it already is. College hoops continuing to pick up steam as we get closer and closer to March. A ton going on today. Duke, a heavy favorite up against Virginia, 13.5 points. Some local flavor, Nichols, 10.5 points up against UNO. A ton that you can get in on. And even if you miss opening tip, you can still get in through all the live betting. Bet on a fourth quarter comeback, who's going to win the quarter, scoring leaders, who scores, all these other pieces. There's so much for you to check out over at FanDuel today, especially if you're a new customer, because new customers will get $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. All you got to do is head over to FanDuel.com to get started today. It's FanDuel.com for your chance at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. All right, family. If the New Orleans Saints want to make that transition from their 4-2-5 heavy nickel defense to more of a 3-4 odd front defense, they're going to need speed pass rushers and athletic pass rushers over on the outside. In this year's NFL draft class, whether they want to jump at 9 or whether they want to wait until the middle of the third round, provides the New Orleans Saints exactly what it is that they need to be able to start to build towards that talent. And over on the offensive line, building the trenches, also very possible through this year's NFL draft without having to sprint to the podium at 9 to be able to grab that talent. So what I wanted to do here was that I kind of wrote out for the first 4 selections that the New Orleans Saints have, which are 4 top 100 selections. Round 1, pick 9, round 2, pick 40, round 3, pick 71, and pick 93, both of those in the third round. The possibilities at each of those picks in terms of building up your trenches early in the draft. And then I have 2 mock drafts that are just these quick 3-round mock drafts that I want to hear from you. Which one is your favorite? Which way would you go? All these other things. So here's the deal. At pick 9, let's say that the New Orleans Saints wanted to invest in one of those speedy pass rushers, right? Speed and athleticism being the focus at edge rusher. Georgia's Jalon Walker, Tennessee's James Pearce Jr., and then Marshall's Mike Green, all will be available at pick 9. And so you might feel that Mike Green is somebody that's too much of a reach at 9, but James Pearce Jr. is more polished, or Jalon Walker is more polished, and so you'd like to go with them. Totally fine. Totally fine. But the idea here is you can make these selections at 9. Then let's say you wanted to turn around and go with an offensive lineman at pick 40. Then you run into guys like North Dakota State offensive lineman Gray Zabel, as well as who's a little bit more versatile, can move around. You're probably drafting somebody to play in your interior more than you're drafting somebody to play at tackle, depending upon how Kellen Moore and Brendan Nugent feel about Trevor Penning over at right tackle. You know that no matter what, last year's first round pick, Taliesin Fuanga, is going to play at either left tackle or right tackle. You know one of your tackle spots is nailed down. So you could grab a guy like Gray Zabel, who can play anywhere on your offensive line that you want him to. Donovan Jackson out of Ohio State could be a selection to play on the interior. You could even go for a tackle at pick 40 as well. Or you can go an entirely different way and draft like a cornerback in Trey Amos, or a wide receiver at Alec Alumanor, or Jack Besh out of TCU. There's just so many different routes that you can go while still building your trenches. Let's say you didn't take a defensive lineman in the first round and you wanted to wait until you got into the third round, and you're saying, you know what, I'm not really worried as much about edge rusher. I want to build the interior. Great. That's where you can run into guys like Deon Walker out of Kentucky, 6'7", 340, 330 plus pounds. Humongous dude that can play that nose tackle spot for you in a 3-4 defense and help you be able to begin to excel and build towards what it is that you're looking at doing. Let's say that instead you took an edge rusher at 9, you took an offensive lineman at 40, and then you don't feel like taking another defensive lineman or another offensive lineman at 71. So then you go for a Xavier Watts, the safety out of Notre Dame, or you go for a tight end like a Harold Fannin Jr. out of Bowling Green, or a Mason Taylor out of LSU. Fine. Because then as you roll back around to pick 93, there's 3 different Georgia offensive linemen in Tate Radledge, Jared Wilson, as well as Dylan Fairchild, that could all potentially start for you at left guard if you wanted them to. Or you can go back to defensive tackle after that with guys like Elijah Roberts, who comes out of SMU, is a little bit more of a Tano Passanio type that can play outside, can move inside, kind of do a little bit of everything. Or Jordan Phillips out of Maryland, who can be a little bit more of that anchoring nose tackle for you. So what I mean to illustrate here is that you can sprint at 9 for a defensive lineman or an offensive lineman if you want to. But you could also take that top wide receiver, take that top running back, that top playmaker. That's kind of my rule for the New Orleans Saints at 9, is not best player available necessarily, but best playmaker available at whatever position. And then you can turn around at pick 40, address either edge rusher or offensive line. You can come back to pick 71 and address edge rusher or defensive line edge rusher or offensive line. Or you can come back and pick 93 in the third round and address a different position entirely, or offensive line, or interior defensive line. There's just a lot of flexibility here. And so this idea that the Saints absolutely have to spend pick 9 on an offensive lineman, not really. Kind of don't have to. And the idea of switching to this 3-4 kind of defense is great for New Orleans because their prototype, their typical prototype that they followed for some time, could still work. The edge rusher Michael Williams out of Georgia, or Shamar Stewart out of Texas A&M. Those guys work if you still want to follow that, because they can play that 3-4 defensive end, or you can go with the more dynamic, athletic, smaller pass rushers like a Jalon Walker or a James Pearce Jr. or a Mike Green in the first round. So there's a lot of opportunity here. And there's not really a way to screw this up if you're the New Orleans Saints, if I'm being completely honest. Like, it's very, very tough to mess this all up. And so let's look at two different mock drafts. I did one where I went edge rusher in the first round, and then I went offensive line in the second round. Another where I actually went offensive line in the first round, as well as edge rusher in the second round. Tell me which one you like. So at one of these is starting off at pick 1-9 with round 1, pick 9, with edge rusher James Pearce Jr. out of Tennessee. Him and Jalon Walker, Mike Green, whichever one, honestly. James Pearce Jr. is just probably my favorite one because Jalon Walker has kind of done the hybrid thing a little bit too much. James Pearce Jr. has been a focused pass rusher, so I went with him at 9. At round 2, pick 40, North Dakota State University offensive lineman Gray Zabel, play him wherever you want. At round 3, pick 71, I went with Jaden Higgins, the wide receiver out of Iowa State. And then I went back to the trenches at defensive tackle at pick 93 with Jordan Phillips out of Maryland. So I was able to address edge rusher, offensive line, defensive tackle, while also adding a wide receiver in those first 3 picks. I've still got 2 4th-round picks, a 6th-round pick, and at least 1 7th-round pick to continue to build around. In the 4th round, I can go for another offensive lineman or a tight end, or I can go for a running back and kind of do a little bit of anything you want. So that's one of them. Okay. James Pearce Jr., Gray Zabel, Jaden Higgins, as well as Jordan Phillips. Okay. The next one, round 1, pick 9, I went with Armand Membou out of Missouri. Interior offensive lineman, works right away, would start for you. Has played a little bit of left guard, but has mostly played right tackle in college. But at 6'3", 300+ pounds, he's going to play on the interior in college. You can go with Will Campbell out of LSU, plug him into the interior. I think top 10 is too early for an interior offensive lineman, but we're playing with hypotheticals here, nothing else. So Armand Membou going right there. Then in pick 40, round 2, take your pick. Donovan Ezeraku coming out of Boston College. Jack Sawyer coming out of Ohio State. Princely Umanmielen coming out of Ole Miss. Take your pick, effectively, right? Any edge rusher. I'll go with Ezeraku in this situation. So Armand Membou and then Donovan Ezeraku to start us off. Then pick 71 in the 3rd round, I went with running back Caleb Johnson out of Iowa. Why not? Just to show you don't have to necessarily run early for a running back. You can still grab a solid one late. And then defensive tackle again at pick 93, Darius Alexander out of Toledo, Shamar Stewart out of Texas A&M, Jordan Phillips out of Maryland, Elijah Roberts out of SMU, Joshua Farmer out of Florida State. Pick one, right? Nice and easy. So for me, I go with Darius Alexander because I like the versatility there. And so Armand Membou, Donovan Ezeraku, Caleb Johnson, Darius Alexander. That again allows me to address interior offensive line, edge rusher, running back in this case, and then defensive tackle. There you go. I like them both. I have no qualms with either of these. And I don't have any qualms with going with the playmaker first and then backing things up and going offensive line a little bit later, going edge rusher a little bit later, going defensive tackle a little bit later. It doesn't make any difference to me. Let me know if it makes a difference to you. But for Mock Draft Monday, I think the takeaway here is that the Saints have absolutely every opportunity with free agency still taken into account to come into the draft and continue to address their trenches should they decide to do so. The New Orleans Saints are closer now to hiring their 3 coordinators, including the most important one on defense. I'll give you a quick update on where things stand and where we expect things to go. We got that next for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Let's get it, Who Dat Nation. The New Orleans Saints are close to hiring really kind of all 3 of their coordinator spots, but they're particularly close to hiring their offensive coordinator and defensive coordinator, and both of the favorites still very much on the board for New Orleans. The most important hire that Kellen Moore is going to make when it comes to his coordinators group. And remember, the Saints are going to be hiring 3 coordinators here: offensive coordinator, defensive coordinator, and special teams coordinator. And defensive coordinator is one that they're closest to getting done. We broke down the candidates there already. Brandon Staley, looking at a guy like Daronte Jones out of Minnesota. I almost said Miami again, just like I did earlier today. And then, of course, Christian Parker, who is a guy that's been like closer and closer and closer to landing defensive coordinator spots. I think your top two guys are probably Staley and Parker. I think Staley's still the favorite because of the amount of familiarity that he and Kellen Moore have, as opposed to Moore and Parker, who have effectively 1 year of familiarity with one another. But still, I think either one of those guys is a solid hire for New Orleans. I think Christian Parker maybe brings you some of the like newer ideas and things like that, but I think Staley does too. I think the only thing that makes me nervous about Staley is how much that defense did not work over in Los Angeles with the Chargers. But I mean, look, I've spent year after year after year saying, hey, Dennis Allen's a better defensive coordinator than he is a head coach. I think the same of guys like Matt Eberflus. I think the same of a guy like Brandon Staley as well. And so I don't think Brandon Staley at all would be a bad hire. In fact, he might be the safe hire, right? Because you kind of know what you're going to get with him. Christian Parker is a little bit more of an unknown, but boy, is he an exciting unknown in terms of what he might be able to bring. The other thing that all three of these guys check, like another box they all check, is that all three of them, Christian Parker, Daronte Jones, and Brandon Staley, have all had a lot of experience or are actively spending their time coaching secondaries. Brandon Staley, you got to go back a little bit, but he kind of started off mostly with the secondary before he moved over to coaching linebackers and things like that. And then both Jones and Parker focus on secondary play, defensive back play right now. And so that's a really interesting thing for New Orleans, that they continue to kind of go back to those guys that have focused on the back end play, which I actually think is a solid option. And then let the defensive line coach come in and coach the defensive lines and all those other things. I think you're building out your scheme one way or another. But that is something else that the Saints have kind of leaned in on, has been sort of the defensive backs experience or secondary coach experience, at least at some point in the career. But again, with Jones and Parker, that's the active part of their career right now. And so, look, the Saints have done everything that they need to do at this point to be able to hire a defensive coordinator. I expect that hire to happen probably early this week. I'd be kind of surprised if it didn't, if I'm being honest. And so I think we could see that begin to move here on, as here in the next day or so, maybe even by the time that you're listening to or watching this. So we'll continue to keep you up to date on it, of course. And in fact, I was just checking to see just now, like, that's how quickly I expect this to move. I was checking just now to see, like, okay, are we moving? Is anything happening? So that's what I think is going to happen over at defensive coordinator. I would put Parker or Staley up at the top in terms of likelihood of getting the job, with Staley being the most likely of the two. Offensive coordinators still need to get at least one more interview with a minority candidate, which includes either coaches of color or non-male candidates. And so I think the way that we look at this, actually, I think the NFL specifies female candidate, if I remember correctly. And so the way that we look at this is that the Saints are almost there, right? They've interviewed the favorite in Doug Nussmeier, which is the guy that everybody kind of expects to get the offensive coordinator job. He traveled with Kellen Moore as an offensive coordinator quarterback duo from Dallas to Los Angeles to Philly. Now Kellen Moore gets the promotion to head coach. Seems very likely that Doug Nussmeier would get the promotion to offensive coordinator from quarterbacks coach, and then hire another quarterbacks coach. But the Saints also interviewed Robert Prince, who's got 39 years of coaching experience, has spent a lot of time with wide receivers, has worked with some very good wide receivers, got kind of the best out of Reggie Williams over in Jacksonville, coached Calvin Johnson and Golden Tate and Kenny Golladay during his time in Detroit. And he has extensive experience with Kellen Moore as well. It hasn't been as recent as Doug Nussmeier has been, but Robert Prince coached wide receivers at Boise State while Kellen Moore was the quarterback at Boise State. Robert Prince coached wide receivers with the Detroit Lions while Kellen Moore was a quarterback with the Detroit Lions. And then the two overlapped as offensive coordinator and wide receivers coach in, I think it was Kellen Moore's final year in Dallas. And then Kellen Moore left to go to Los Angeles and then Philly. Robert Prince stayed in Dallas in 2023 and 2024, and then literally took a job as a wide receivers coach in Miami like 3 weeks ago. And now is already being interviewed for the Saints offensive coordinator position, which he can do because it's a promotion. So it doesn't matter that he got hired somewhere else already. It's a promotion. So he could bounce on Miami to come here to New Orleans. which historically has worked out great for New Orleans. So we'll see which way that all goes, but you can feel kind of the continuity between both of these two candidates, or the familiarity, I should say, between both of these two candidates when it comes to Kellen Moore. Nussmeier brings more of the continuity, though, because he's been there every step of the way for the past few years. And so I think that's probably what makes Nussmeier the favorite. Also, Nussmeier started his career here as a fourth-round draft pick back in 1996. His son plays football right up the road, and Garrett Nussmeier at LSU, who could potentially be entering the draft next year. Like, there's a lot of other reasons to like Nussmeier as a potential favorite for the job. But the Saints still have to interview at least one more candidate. And again, that candidate must be of minority status. And then the Saints can make their hire at offensive coordinator. Special teams coordinator, I'm expecting Phil Galliano to be the guy. Marwan Malouf would be another name to watch, who Darren Rizzi brought in as a kind of special teams assistant, if you will, over the course of the offseason. Or excuse me, not over the course of the offseason, mid-season when he took over as the interim. So either one of those guys I think would be there. Same thing, gotta satisfy the Rooney Rule and everything on the way there. But we'll see which way things go there at special teams coordinator. But I would expect Galliano to at least be high up on the list to land that gig. And then the other one that the Saints kind of have to go through a process for is going to be quarterback coach. Quarterback coaches now, you're required to interview at least one minority candidate or candidate of minority status at quarterback coach as well. You don't have to do two, but you got to interview one. And so we'll see which way things go. I think you got to get the offensive coordinator. It's likely that they'll get the offensive coordinator in place first, but you don't necessarily have to in that situation. And so, watching at quarterback coach, I think one of the most popular names has been Kirby Moore, the offensive coordinator over at Mizzou, but it's an SEC school that pays a lot of money and everything like that. At Missouri, is he going to want to leave to come to the NFL for the sake of coming to the NFL, even if it means a potential pay cut going from an offensive coordinator of an SEC school, which pays a lot of money, those college programs, to taking a quarterback position coach job in the NFL, which still, you make some good money, but I imagine there's a deficit there. And so we'll have to see exactly what goes on there. But expect that to be a little bit more of a process than wide receivers. Well, wide receivers coach, they kept Keith Williams in place already. But like offensive line, they just went and hired a guy. You know what I mean? And so you can't do that at quarterback coach. You got to satisfy a Rooney Rule there too. But expect all this stuff to move quickly because the combine is on the way. I'll be there in Indianapolis. I'll be there for most of it. I'll be there for the Saints related stuff, not necessarily for the workouts and all that kind of stuff. But man, interesting now, like things continue to move very quickly here in New Orleans. And so I hope that we're keeping you up to date the way that you want to here at Locked On Saints. If not, tell me so I can be better. But we're here for you every single day, Monday through Friday. By the way, somebody told me that if you're using Amazon's ad-free stuff, that you're not getting the Saturday and Sunday episodes. I don't think that they take the weekend episodes and put those up. So you're only getting the 5 days a week. If you want 7 days a week, though, every other platform, it's available. So if you want the Saturday and Sunday shows, I would just check a different platform for those. All right. Coming up in tomorrow's episode, hopefully we'll have some more updates for you about what's going on here. But also, what are we really expecting to see from the New Orleans Saints offense in 2025 in terms of big shifts, big changes based upon what we've seen from Kellen Moore? I want to dive in and get into a little bit more of the nitty-gritty play or offensive play caller stuff for Kellen Moore, because I don't think replicating what he did in Philadelphia is really what we're going to see here in New Orleans. That's coming up in tomorrow's episode, as well as hopefully updates on coordinator positions. We appreciate you very much, as always. Make us a part of your day, part of your routine for saying yes to me and the show. If you see me, please say hi. If you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on your favorite social media at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing. Let me know how you're living. Let me know how you're momming them. And trust Who Dat Nation. I'll holla at you.